Serafina Pastore, Davide Assolini, Ansonia Marsaggio. I hope I pronounced it well.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Serafina Pastore. I'm associate professor at the University of VIII. My research field is classroom. Oh, yeah, better.
Thank you. Perfect.
In educational assessment and instructional design. Together with Davide and Sonia, we performed this study that is in infancy, so it's important for us to gather also your feedback because we want to improve our perspective. So the topic is about the idea of investigate using large questionnaires like TALIS or the teacher questionnaire related to peers and teams, focusing on teacher assessment practices. Okay. I will try to do my best because I'm alone, so I have to thank you, Sonia and Davide, for the analysis that they have realized. So let's try to frame the study because, you know, over the last 20 years, in all countries, more or less, we have had a similar process related to the widespread diffusion of the neoliberal system in school. And also we heard in previous presentation the focus on improvement in school systems, the pressure on teachers, and the idea that teacher education and teacher curriculum have to be very critical in terms of guaranteeing the quality of the education and, of course, the learning students' achievement. So these topics are very related and connected among them: educational quality, teaching quality, professional development of teachers, and more specifically related to the student learning, the assessment practices, and therefore how teachers are prepared to enact assessment in classrooms, so assessment literacy. More specifically, over the years, the research in education related to these two topics have been very broad and differentiated. Try to understand how to support teachers in the development of this specific competence, assessment practice, and investigating if and to what extent professional development has been supportive in terms of improvement. Sometimes also in terms of, help teachers managing what are the policy innovations. If I talk from my home country, Italy, 3 years ago we have for primary school a radical shift in the assessment practices because teachers have been requested to switch from summative assessment that has been extensively used for decades to formative assessment that is completely different in terms of rationale and practices, of course. So the aim of this study are to provide, we try, an extensive cross-national comparison within European context, focusing on the evolution of teacher assessment practices and teacher professional patterns. And second time to highlight if and to what extent variables investigated at international large-scale surveys, as I tell you, OECD TALIS and ER teams and peers questionnaire connected to teacher assessment teacher questionnaire are linked to the current conceptualization of teacher assessment literacy. So these are the research questions. So which variation across grades and countries can be identified in teacher education assessment parts? And in this case, the indicators have been considered focusing both on training, continuous professional development, and initial teacher education also. And the second aspect is related to the assessment practices, and specifically in terms of methods and strategies teachers use, and how they differentiate in case between, for example, formative assessment and summative assessment, or about, for example, another practices related to the use of homework for students learning. So the conceptual framework we use for this study is made by three different concepts that are very interconnected. So teacher assessment literacy, teacher assessment practices, and teacher professional development. The most important thing, of course, is to define what is teacher assessment literacy, because generally is defined, as you can see, as a set of knowledge and skills a teacher needs to effectively enact assessment in classroom. However, this definition is not really informative, about what I have to do in my classroom in terms of assessment. And this concept is one of the hottest topic in the context of educational research in this moment, because also it has a very long history, more than 65 years. And over these years, we can identify very different conceptualization. So it's interesting to focus on this conceptualization and then try to understand how these conceptualizations are or not considered in the international programs. So originally the idea of assessment literacy was very in terms of skills and practice. So what I picture has to do in classroom. The effect of professional standards in this debate has been very, very strong, because this concept has been more related to the Anglo-Saxon debate about teacher professional development and teaching quality also. So the idea of professional standards will state what a teacher has to do in classroom, oriented, of course, the idea of teacher assessment literacy over the years. And this is, I was thinking to your presentation before, is related also to the idea of initial teacher education, because the idea is to provide, basic knowledge and skills for teacher to, enter in the classroom and try to deal with the assessment problems. But over the years, this perspective has been very disappointing for many aspects. First of all, the idea that teachers tend to not change assessment practice very easily. Reforms or change in policy not always guarantee a new practice for teachers in terms of assessment. So the idea is now to understand how effectively support teachers in developing this kind of literacy or competence. And the idea of the change that have been realized over the years is also related to the terms, the expressions that we use. Because during the last 10 years, instead of teacher assessment literacy, you will find also other expressions, such as teacher assessment capability or teacher assessment competence. And so this is something very interesting. And the new conceptualization that have been realized have been influenced over the years by these four main phenomena that are the widespread diffusion of the social cultural perspective. Since 2013, for example, Australian colleagues like Willis and others have stressed the idea that assessment is a social cultural practice, especially in the classroom, of course, but is influenced by aspects such as the relationship in the school system, the cultural aspects, the school organization, the school leadership, and so other variables. So it's not, you know, one definition that fits for all. This is something very interesting. So also the idea of the professional standards, you know, is not working in this case, because it can apply, it should be applied only in some context, not in other. The other big change is related to, since 1998, to the widespread diffusion of the concept and practice of formative assessment, of, if you prefer, assessment for learning, that has been considered like a lever to improve over the years educational systems. If I think to the UK system, or also to the US or Canada, for example, there have been a very, very great change in terms of support for teachers in order to introduce this kind of practice in classroom, because it's not easy. The idea, the third thing, is related to the idea that assessment literacy is linked to teacher professionalism, so the idea that teacher has of himself or herself as a professional, and therefore the idea of the concept of competence approach. What does it mean? That we don't need only a list of practical skills and knowledge. The idea of competence is related also to other aspects, such as, for example, the dispositions teachers have in relation to some aspects, in this case, for example, assessment. And this aspect is related to the last change, and which represents a very interesting topic in terms of research, teachers' conceptions. So what teacher thinks about assessment and how they change their conception and therefore their practices in response to innovation or policy change. So all these change have led to new conceptualization of teacher assessment that I try to systematically review in this paper that has been published last July. Is a systematic review, has been published in Frontiers. And in this article I try to report how this concept has been changed over the years and now how it's conceptualized. So the idea is that it's very complicated in terms of, I don't know whether it's not here, anyway. Okay, it's more broad and differentiated. Do you want to come? Davide?
No, thank you.
Okay. The second topic, the second aspect of our conceptual framework is related to the concept of teacher training and teacher professional development. This picture represents, you know, the idea that sometimes policy innovations are like waves. So they are represented to create great change, but sometimes then under the water, under the surface of the water, teachers don't change the practice. So we know now, after more than 20 years of research, how teacher trainer can be supported. For example, one of the most important things is related to the duration of professional development course. We know that, for example, short courses are not very effective in terms of change because teacher needs to be more supported over time in a reiterative way in their understanding of the innovation. The rule of content knowledge and also the idea, this is something stressed, for example, also in the TALIS results, about the idea of something that is very engaging for teachers, so something active, not the idea of, you know, the classical idea of the lessons or the informative training session that is not sometimes very helpful. So active, collaborative, engaging, and classroom invited learning models, because they have to try to enact what is required. And so the last aspect is also related to the idea that long-term and on-job training programs are generally better to support also teachers in changing their conception, because sometimes, change of culture is more complicated and require more and more time. So what we have tried to realize, this is an empirical analysis. Is related to a longitudinal and cross-national study, and so we have defined a temporal and cross-national analysis of indicators that have been realized considering the years, at least 2 points in times, and in terms of country, Europe and OECD countries, and focusing on different education level. For example, primary for grade and secondary 8th grade for this survey. First, focusing on 2001, 2016 and 2021 teams, 2011, 15 and 19, and for TALIS, 2008, 13 and 18. So we focus only in two areas of investigation. So the first is training on student assessment, considering both initial teacher education and continuous professional development, and this is something related to, the second aspect is related to the perceived need teachers have in terms of learning needs for assessment. Yeah. Two, the second aspect is related to the methods used, or the different methods they use to practice assessment. You will see how these two indicators have been covered over the years, and considering also the different questionnaires that we have considered, so PIRLS, TEAMS, and TALIS. And now we show you only a few data related to PIRLS reading. And as you can see in the first grade, there is a very unexpected, for some aspects, variability across countries related to the perceived usefulness of initial teacher education for assessment. And surprisingly, also in countries like US, where professional standards continue to be very strong. About the practices, the homework is something that is very common as a practice, but teachers tend to use in a different way. For example, in Italy, we use a lot homework, but generally teachers say that they don't rely on this kind of assessment because they know that parents generally tend to support students. So it's more like a kind of training and not an effective way to assess effectively the level of learning achieved. So few teachers effectively discuss homework in the classroom. About the professional development in TALIS, in this case, many of them have participated over the last 2 years in initiative for professional development, and this is something that should be very interesting to better understand. For example, in Italy or in other countries such as Singapore, in these two waves, 2015 and 2018, there have been substantial reforms for teacher education also, and in Italy, for example, the introduction of the national evaluation system. So maybe this professional development path has been realized considering these institutional reforms. This is something that has to be better understood. And one of the out of 10 teachers recognize that they have a substantial need to better improve their assessment. So assessment is something that they perceive as a learning need. Here you will see the different practices in terms of assessment, and the most interesting aspect for me is the idea that there is a conflection of different practices, very different practices. For example, the use of tests, as you can see in the first on the left, or the use of written feedback, but on the test, or in the button you will see the use of oral feedback or immediate feedback, generally, during discussion in the classroom. That is something completely different from the other two. And also, this is something that is related also, for example, in Italy, with the introduction of formative assessment, teachers tend to not use or to promote students to use self-assessment. That is something very complicated in terms of practices. So here we will see that there are very different aims in terms of assessment. So summative and formative are together, and they are not differentiated in the right way. So what has been in terms of discussion? I think that it's clear the misalignment that has been reflected in our analysis between the concept of the conceptualization of teacher assessment literacy in this nowadays and the idea of the teacher assessment practices that have been investigated in these large-scale surveys. There is not sufficient differentiation among assessment practices, and we have to question if it's really helpful to have this, broad brush information in terms of not only policymakers, but I think also teacher education. And so I think a need of conceptual framework is urgent for teacher assessment literacy, also because we have new targets. I think, for example, concept of IE, artificial intelligence, or I don't know, the new educative scenario that has been reported also during the pandemic. For example, the situation of remote instruction is something that has been completely unexpected for teachers, but sometimes they have learned how to deal also in this situation. So if we want to have a comparative framework, in this case, we think that the conceptual framework is needed, a new conceptual framework. So that's all. Future steps, of course, are related to our further analysis. So we want to focus on other indicators which are available, only on the most recent time point. We will work on country-level correlation analysis, and then we will try to consider also correlation between teacher level of the assessment indicators. I think I've done with my time. Sorry if I'm late. Thank you.
Thank you very much.